A very warm welcome to Doorway to Sindh, presented by Sindhi Culture Foundation and the Embassy Group. My love for Sindh grew from the stories my grandmother and father shared of the happy memories of home, which I'm sure many of you have heard from your parents and grandparents. I used to consider it a compliment when somebody said to me that I don't look like a Sindhi or I don't dress like a Sindhi, till one day I questioned why I considered it a compliment. I then realized that what had survived was the food. I knew nothing about our material culture from which we were divorced. That is when my journey to discover Sindhi history and culture began, as I unwrapped the negative perceptions and embraced my rejected identity. We invite you to Doorway to Sindh to join us in our journey to discover Sindh's rich history and culture. We will bring to you videos in conversation with eminent scholars, artists, musicians and poets. You will see images of Sindh's ancient sites, monuments, architecture, textiles and craft traditions from antiquity. We hope that this glimpse inspires you to discover more about Sindhi history and culture.
Thank you, Aruna ma'am. I'm Vidya Tevani. I'm doing my PhD from the Department of English from SNDT Women's University in Mumbai. And my proposed thesis is on post-partition Sindhi identity through a reading of select literary works. I'm an assistant professor of English at a law college in Mumbai. In the past, I've had an opportunity to work with Dr. Rita Kothari as a research assistant. I feel privileged to introduce our esteemed speakers for today, Dr. Kalimullah Ashari and Dr. Manan Ahmed Asif. Thank you, sir, for being here. Dr. Kalimullah Ashari is an archaeologist, historian, and author. In March 2019, he was awarded the Sitara-e-Imtiaz, the third highest honor and civilian award in Sindh. Born in Ladkana in Sindh, he obtained a master's degree in arts and a doctor of philosophy from the University of Karachi. In 2002, he received a DAAD postdoctoral studies fellowship in Islamic period archaeology at the Islamic Art Museum, Berlin, Germany. In 2006, Sir received a postdoctoral fellowship from the University of Wisconsin, Madison, United States. Sir occupied various administrative posts and retired in the year 2013. He continues to work towards the preservation of the cultural heritage in Sindh and is a member of various boards and committees that protect the physical heritage of Sindh. As a scholar of applied archaeology, Sir has written many books on archaeology, history, and literature. His recent book is The Epigraphy of Makli. Thank you, sir, for agreeing to be with us here today. Our next speaker is Dr. Manan Ahmed Asif. Dr. Manan Ahmed Asif is currently an associate professor of history at Columbia University. His areas of specialization include intellectual history in South and Southeast Asia, critical philosophy of history, colonial and anti-colonial thought. He was born in Lahore. After completing his BA from the University of Punjab in 1991, at the age of 18, he traveled to the United States to become an engineer. However, he found his interest in history and obtained a BA from Miami University in 1997. He then moved on to do a PhD in history from the University of Chicago and was awarded the same in the year 2008. He is the author of the books A Book of Conquest, Chachnama and Muslim Origins in South Asia, and The Loss of Hindustan, The Invention of India. He has extensive background in digital history, in the history of archives in the global south, and the problems of access and control to digitized materials. Sir is also the founder of the blog Chapati Mystery, and his writings have appeared in magazines and newspapers in South Asia, Middle East, North Europe, and North America. Thank you, sir, for taking your time to be with us today. We now move on to the topic of the session today, Chachnama. The word first fell on my ears from the doting voice of my Nana. He would say, Chachname je bare mein budho tei, khabar tei Raja Dahir Ker ho. I wonder if he told me the story, for I seem to not recall it. The names came back to me in my conscious memory only recently when I read about the Chachnama. The Sindh story has a chapter on Dahir Sen, borrowing heavily from the Chachnama. He writes, and I present excerpts here. Chachnama, the most authentic and almost contemporary account of Arab invasions of Sindh, reports that as early as 638 AD, Khalifa Umar and sent Mughira to launch naval attack against Sindh, but it was repulsed on the Indian side. The Chachnama lists 6 major attempts in the next 80 years, but they were all repulsed. In 711, Muhammad bin Qasim started for Sindh at the head of the Iraqi, Syrian, and other Arab soldiers of fortune. On the evening of Thursday, the 16th June, in 712 AD, the Arab conquered the Sindh. What was the story of Muhammad bin Qasim's arrival in Sindh? Who was Raja Dahir? What does the Chachnama have to tell us about the history of Sindh? These are some of the questions that we seek to ask and deliberate on in our session today, Chachnama. So my first question is fielded to both the speakers today. So how would you introduce the Chachnama to a 20-year-old Sindhi, imagining that this is a post-dinner family gathering and that a young Sindhi is intrigued to know more about the history of Sindh?
If I may take lead to respond to you in the field which is very much the domain of Asif Saab, but while we are talking to the laymen and to the young people who might not be having difficulties and the burden of a narrative which is already available in the market. Chachnama has been given weight by the scholars, and this is the reason that this source material has been gaining the weight. And in Sindh, it has been really been of considered of very much importance, which is not due to the material which is contained into it, because the Chachnama, which has been defined as Fatahnama, already shows a greater level of bias by its editor, which during the 13th century considers and takes into account the Arab invasion as one act of goodness. And understandably, because he belongs to the Sakafi Khandan, he is again tracing back his ancestry to the person who was commander in chief of the invading army. So there was this reason. Second reason was that these were the times when another spell of Muslim conquest happening in this region. He used to live in Uch Sharif, from where he came to his in-laws in Rodi, and then he found this material which he edited and translated. The whole translation, if seen carefully, shows that it has been copied from some material which was available with the family and has been edited with heavy hand, because he uses the terminologies which are current of the 12th and 13th century. That means he is influenced by the contemporary understanding of that particular past, which is again related to the Arab invasion. If he would have happened to have the source with him of the late 8th century or the 9th century, we would have found the tone very differently. Because when we go back and we try to understand the times which are there, the Chachnama seems to be a defense, an apology, and an explanation and excuse for the invasion of Arab armies. To find a story of somebody who are desperate women in need of help writes to the Caliph, and the Caliph promptly responds, is the beginning of this whole system of Arab invasion. So you see, the whole book is based on the first class defense literature. It is ignoring the whole Umayyad forward policy that was based on aggression. The Umayyad period, we see that the Arab armies were actually invading, going out to the every part of the known world, and it was because you see those were the times when the Byzantine Empire was weaker. Same was the case with the Persian Empire, that was also weaker. And going to the Maghreb, we find that there was no formidable military outfit available in the Maghreb, that is the northern Africa. So those were the times that when the newfound unity within the Arab tribes gave them this impetus to go forward. And they were moving to every nick and corner of the world. So it wasn't the letter of the lady and her desperation which called the Arab invasion. So this is something which from its very beginning is based on a theory which is again to be taken as an excuse and as an apology. So this is the basic of that particular writer. Now we going back, leaving this weakness of the material, let us see the strengths of the material, which was in the hands of Ali Kufi Sahib. The strength lies in the first-hand account of those letters which were sent to the Muhammad bin Qasim and which the Muhammad bin Qasim sent back to the Hijaz bin Yusuf. So this correspondence has been quoted in detail. So this is the strength of this book. And this strength in itself should be read very carefully and critically. Now this particular correspondence shows that this whole exercise was fully controlled by a center. So the central government was in command, and central government was not ready to see the aspirations of the locals, and it was based upon a total consideration of economy. The whole outfit was, when the preparations were made for the invasion of Sindh, it cost some money to the government. And here the governor Hajjaj bin Yusuf promised to the central government that they are going to pay back in huge gains. So this was, from very outfit, it was looked upon as an exercise for the social and economic gains. So, and everybody knows that the war itself and invasion itself in the ancient world and even today is for the economic benefits. So this is very visible from this critical analysis of this book. So the Chachnama basically opens up our mind to the world which was way back in the 8th century, 7th, 8th and 9th centuries of Arab world, which had its own huge problems. It was a boiling pot of the troubles. As you see, the Muhammad bin Qasim's invasion was 13th in its sequence to this part of world. There had been already so many attempts, and which had some successes and some failures. Arab armies had already taken over the Persian Empire and the related area, which is the Makran itself, the part of subcontinent presently, was already under with them when Muhammad bin Qasim arrives in Makran. and he was further helped by the local stationed army, and then he proceeded to Sindh. So you see, this is a very well planned and a deliberate exercise. It was not just to rush, go get the women out of the trouble. So this theory was flawed, and it is no more viable. The other important aspect about the Chachnama should be that one should see it in the background of what Arab armies were doing in other part of world. When they were on their forward march, what actually they did? They were capturing the people, sending them back to the Arab world as slaves, and similar exercise were being done in Sindh as well. So from very first month of their sojourn into Sindh, they were sending back the slaves and sending back the money. So there is no such uh, sort of information regarding that particular lady and about the pirates. Where are those pirates? Who were those pirates? What happened to those pirates? And was this piracy exterminated by the Arab armies? Or this piracy being the part of the reality of the times, which continued much up to the recent past? So this piracy is an ongoing phenomena which has got nothing to do with the countries which were actually around the rim of Indian Ocean. It has continued, and we have the tradition and the historic references that it continued till the late 19th century. So this was there. So there was no such thing that we can see that uh, this account is much authentic. So the whole fabric of it is getting strength only from the correspondence which was quoted at length. Otherwise, the whole narrative is sort of heavily edited, and its origin is not known.
So when we look at this history of this text, what we see is that, as Dr. Lashari explained, it comes to being in some point in the 13th century. But when we look at people who are reading texts in the 13th, 14th, 15th, 16th, 17th centuries, texts such as the Chachnama, nobody really knows about it. Nobody really has read this text. It doesn't have many circulation. I mean, people who are attached to Uch Sharif and are stationed in Multan or are sometimes in Lahore, who have administrative work, they may know of some of these stories, but even if they know the stories in Chachnama, they don't know the text. They haven't read the text. Until Jalaluddin Akbar, we don't have even a manuscript that we can point to that is produced of this text. So whether it's from the 8th century or from the 13th century, what we know is that 16th, 17th century, there isn't any awareness of it. This is not a text like the Mahabharata or the Ramayana or something like the Panchatantra or Arthashastra or anything else. There's no evidence that it exists. So why would your grandfather know about this text at all? Is your grandfather a historian of Persian literature and history? Is your grandfather does he go read really, really old manuscripts? Why would Mirza Khalid Beg in 1900 translate it into English? Why is that a thing? When we see that in 1801, in 1799 to 1801, there is no trace of this text anywhere. No one is talking about it. 100 years ago from Mirza Khalid Beg, nobody's talking about this text, right? So why would your grandfather know about this? So that's where I think we need to understand that this text and its history are two different things. And what happens is that moment in 1800, 1799, 1801, when the Sindh under the Talpur becomes the next phase of British colonial conquest. They have just dealt with Mysore. They have just dealt with the Bombay presidency. And they're looking forward towards Punjab, and they're looking forward towards Sindh. And under this colonial kind of war, one of the things that these colonial officers are interested in is to make an argument about Muslim war in order to justify their war, right? So how did the Sikhs become a force in Punjab? That becomes an argument for Mughal-Sikh discord. How did the Talpurs become rulers of Sindh? Why do we want to take Sindh? Well, it's a port city. It's a very important port city. The Portuguese were in Diu much earlier. The British feel that they should be in Diu. The British feel that they should be in Sindh, right? So for the colonial state, it's important to do two things. One, to control, find out, and mark the river Indus, to control the port city and to control Sindh. And they ultimately are able to do this by 1843. But between 1801 and 1843, the British colonial officers have to construct a history of Sindh, a history of Kutch, a history of Uch, a history of Thar, a history of Indus Valley, what becomes Indus Valley. And it's there that Chachnama is discovered. And it's there that the Chachnama becomes an important history for Sindh. It has really no value before that. Nobody cares about it. Some people like Farishta and Abul Fazl, big historians, but that's their job. The historian's job is to read everything possible. But the ordinary citizens, they don't need to read everything that's needed. If Farishta talks about, in the Deccan, he talks about Chachnama, is because he's going to libraries and he's opening up these accounts. He never says that, if you walk down the street in Uch, people are talking about the Chachnama. He never says that. What happens is that under the colonial period, when Sindh is conquered in 1843, a history is manufactured for Sindh. For this history, Chachnama is very, very important. And that's why it's collected, its manuscripts are collected. It's excerpted, starts to be translated. Sections of it are starting to be translated. That's why people like Daud Pota or Mirza Khalid Beg are in 1900, 1930, are making new translations of the text because the colonial British officers have translated sections of this text. That's when the idea of Sindh, Sindh language, which is being invented, as in the script is being invented under Richard Frere. The principality, like the contours of the Sindhi state, is being manufactured. Educational institutes are being set up. So when all of this is happening in between 1840s and 1900s, 1910s, in that period, that's when Chachnama becomes a text that has to be studied, translated. That's when Chachnama has to be, the stories of Chachnama are to be told and retold. Now, what happens is that in the 19th and 20th century, this text is serving what purpose? It's serving the purpose of 19th and 20th century. Just like in the 13th century, this text was serving the purpose of 13th century, not of 500 years before, whatever the Umayyads were doing. No one cares. No one cares in Sindh what someone in Baghdad is doing. They don't know those people. They have no idea who's there, right? But they have a political project for Uch and for Sindh in the 13th century. So they are writing a history, they're making up these stories in order to do the political dynamics of their moment. Now, what's happening in the 19th and 20th century? No one cares about the 13th century anymore. Why not? Why is no one in the 19th, 20th century saying, Chachnama is the first thing we should read if we want to know what was happening in 13th century Sindh? No one ever said that. No historian, no author said, your grandfather doesn't say that. Now think about it. It's a text from the 13th century. It's a text in Uch of the 13th century. It tells us about the 13th century, right? But nobody's interested in the 13th century in the 19th and 20th century. No one cares about the 13th century. What do they care about in the 19th and 20th century? Well, they care about the 8th century. They're like, well, was there a girl or no? Was there a pirate or no? Why do we care in 1930 if there was a pirate in 680? Does that make sense? Does that make sense that we worry about what a pirate is doing? I'm pretty sure in 1930 there was a pirate right outside Debel in the Arabian Sea. I'm pretty sure if you got on a boat in Rodi in the Indus River, you're going to meet a pirate. I am 100% sure. But that's not what they're saying. They're saying what happened in 680. So what we need to understand is Chachnama is not just a text. It's not just a collection of stories. A Chachnama is a political tool to address the politics of that moment in which people are talking about. So what happens after partition? What happens after partition is Chachnama now becomes a story of Sindhi diaspora, of displacement. So that's the reason your grandfather would know about Chachnama. Not because he's worried about pirates, not because he's worried about Baghdad, not because he's worried about anything else. He's now trying to tell an origin story. He's trying to tell a long history that allows him to understand all of the post-partition world, the world of displacement, when you're moved from your homeland and you're trying to understand the world that you cannot go back to. And the Chachnama, because it's about two worlds, it's about the world of Chach and the world of Muhammad bin Qasim. The Chachnama becomes an important part of that imagination, of this two-world imagination. And I think that's the most important thing that I would say to a 20-year-old, that it's not what is inside the Chachnama, it's why should you know about the Chachnama? Because that's the question that we have to keep asking about the 13th century. Why would they care about the 7th century and the 13th century? 500 years later. Yeah. We are talking about an event of the post-partition that's only 70 some years later. And we already, 70 some years later, we have difficulty having a conversation because time is a very, very hard thing. Now imagine 430 years into the future. Imagine 430 years into the future, people talking about 1947.
Thank you, sir, for that response. My next question is for Dr. Lashari. Sir, what is the physical archaeological evidence that is there to tell us more about the timeline that the Chachnama talks about?
When we look at the evidence which may come from the archaeological sources and which may come from the numismatics, that can tell us something which can substantiate those intentions, the noble intentions of the Arab armies. We find that during the excavations of Bambor, which is the first place which has been presumed to be the debel of the first attack of Muhammad bin Qasim, we have not came across from Bambor any coinage of Umayyads with a sequence. You see, we have found other coinage, the Hindu coinage and the coins from Multan to have been coming out of excavations, but we haven't seen the Umayyad coinage coming out of excavation. You see, that shows what? That shows that the invasion at the time was an isolated act, and it was simply a military exercise. It was the military gains which were, you know, there for the Umayyad Empire, and they were not really sending across the silver or the gold to this area. And then we find that the subsequent period, the trade continued, and this trade is flourishing during the 9th and the 10th centuries, but then it is bowing down, and we have no material coming from the late 12th century. As far as the basic contents of the story are concerned, this is simply verifiable facts. The invasion of the Arab army, yes, because there are so many other sources. These are constantly keep repeating the time frame of the Arab armies invading this part of the world. So this is there. And so many geographers, Arab geographers, have also been to this part of world and have checked the facts of the towns which were there in continuous occupation, and also those towns which were brought into being by the Arab armies as their garrisons. So these are the facts which are staple, standard, and there is no doubt about it. But the doubtful part of the whole story or the whole narrative is that the sort of you see, when we are talking about the invasions, the conquests, the defeats, this is the normal course of life, and it is happening all around. So these facts are undeniable. But the whole narrative which is within the Chachnama becomes very doubtful because it is coming, as Manan Sahib was very correctly saying, that it is referring to the Umayyad period, one. Second, it is referring to the time when it was produced, the 13th century, and then to the time frame when it was reintroduced in the modern world and became available to the students and scholars. So these three periods are crucial and should be looked into in depth. First, I should go back to the Umayyad period. The Umayyads had the crisis of identification. The Umayyads had the crisis of legitimacy. So they fared very well by crushing the claims of Ahl Bayt. They were very heavy handed on that. And when we look into those more than 10,000 epigraphs which are available in Arabia, which are covering from the 630 to the period of 695, this whole period has so many inscriptions. Thousands of these are available. But none of these mention Ahl Bayt. None of these mention the name of Hazrat Muhammad, peace be upon him. They are just not talking about the Muhammad and his family. No inscription gives this. So this is very much written on the rocks all over the Arabia. So this time frame is where everybody is just, hushing up things. The facts are just, uh, pushed aside for the benefit of what? For the benefit of the rulers, for the benefit of those who are in the power. So this is there. Now, this is the time when this whole invasion was planned and launched. So this is the time frame, and subsequently, this comes to be a fact. So this is one side. And you see, the moment this invasion is successful, within the span of 6 years, there is change of heart. A policy changes. All the conquerors are called back. Musa bin Nasir is called from Maghreb. So is Muhammad bin Qas called back from South Asia. Similarly, the Central Asian conquerors are also called back and pushed into oblivion, pushed into persecution. So this is happening. So this is a fact. And it gives us time to reflect upon and check the narrative, whether this narrative confirms this whole change of policy. No, they are not talking about policy. No one is talking about the policy. They are having simply the story to, push out, and the story of Raja Dahar's daughters, and then some sort of blame comes to Muhammad bin Qasim. There was no Raja Dahar's daughter in Maghrib when Musa bin Nasir was called back. So this is just your, excuse me, this is an eyewash. The narrator, which is there in the 13th century, he is facing another problem. And to face this problem, which his part of world was threatened with, was the Mongol invasion. The Mongols were all around them, and Uch, Multan, Lahore were the frontiers of South Asia, fully threatened by the Mongols, which were, making every day the raid was there. And now this narrative of some Muslim event happening there, and so it might have been a product of that particular frame of mind on the part of author to sell this story, that you see there is some sort of Muslim unity within this whole society, and they are facing another invasion where the non-Muslims are attacking. So the Mongols were there. So we can understand that those were not very peaceful times, and those were not at all normal times. And then Manan Sahib was very rightly pointing out that the colonial powers had also the guilt within their conscience. They had occupied an area which was already in the treaties a friend, with which they had no war pacts, with which they have the friendship pacts, and they had the pacts that if somebody from outside comes and invade, so they were to assist Sindh against the invaders. So
Mhm.
where were those pacts gone? So this guilty conscience was the mindset of the British within subcontinent, and specifically within the Sindh. And the scholarship which is being developed within this
At that
area
time.
is driven by some sort of a guilty conscience.
Thank you so much, sir, for that response. Uh, Manan, sir, your views on this, your take on this physical evidence, and something about your book too.
So again, I think Dr. Lashari has made some of the points already that which is how do we think about history? How do we think about any history, any history? depends on many sources, many different sources. So we can look at, as Dr. Lashari is saying, if we look at all of the epigraphs, all of the things people can carve in stone that we know date to a particular time and sometimes to a particular place. Obviously, stones can be carried from one place to another. But let's say that we have some material evidence about the 7th century or the 13th century. That tells us something. Doesn't tell us a lot, but tells us something. So there's no mention of, as Dr. Lashari is saying, there's no mention of any prophets or anything else. But you know what else is there is no mention of? Chach. There's no mention of Dahir. We don't have any graves. We don't have any tombs. We don't have any epigraph. We don't have any numismatics that tells us about all of the things that Chachnama tells us about. We have no evidence of any of that stuff. So it's not only that the fact that Chachnama is talking about a long time ago. Again, remember, 500 years before that Chachnama is talking about. Not just that. It also talking about things that we can't locate through other means, coinage, epigraphs, engravings, etc. So then the question to a historian is, how do we understand this work as history? So I want to show you a couple of things. This is the first page of Chachnama. And the first page of Chachnama, it gives the name of the author, all right, which is right here. Then it tells us that the text was located in a particular place and that it was written in a particular place. Now, what's interesting about this text is that the argument that the author themselves is making is that they're making that this is a mustanad history. This is an authentic history. So a historian says, why would you want to make an argument that whatever it is that you're saying in the 13th century, authentic? What is the claim to authenticity, right? Why would you say that this is correct? You would only say this is correct if you were trying to say against someone else. Either someone else says this something is incorrect, or there's no evidence, right? When someone starts off saying, like, when you introduce your grandfather to someone else, you don't say this is the authentic grandfather. You don't say that. You don't, because he's right there. You don't need to say it's authentic or not. You don't need to make a claim about authenticity. So at the first instant, the claim of authenticity in the Chachnama tells us that something else is happening. Some other political, social, cultural story is happening. It's not about 500 years ago. Whatever was happening 500 years ago, good or bad, it's not about it. And so what we see is that Chachnama has a certain logic to it, right? It begins with the life and conquest of Chach. Then it goes to the lives and conquest of Dahir, who's the son of Chach. Then it talks about the arrival of Muhammad bin Qasim. Then it talks about the death of Dahir, and then it talks about the death of Muhammad bin Qasim. So what happens is that the text is distributed among this structure, very clear structure. Now, what's even more important is that the really clear structure is a mirror of each other. So things that happen in part B first happen in part A. Right? So it's like Chach does something, Chach opens a door and finds a particular thing in there. Muhammad bin Qasim opens a door and finds a particular thing in there. At that point, because of the structure of the narrative, you can say as a reader, you are being asked to connect two things. You're being asked to connect Qasim to Chach, not to Dahir, to Chach. That's why it's called Chachnama, right? So why is that happening? Why is this story so important in the 13th century that we tell the story of Chach and his son? And I think what I tried to show in my book is that what it's doing is drawing upon a very long tradition of storytelling If you look at Panchatantra stories, if you look at Arthashastra, if you look at many of the stories that even come out of Mahabharata or Ramayana, and are, what do we do? What do grandmothers and grandfathers do? They tell us these stories, whether it's about Sita or Ram or Lakshman or whatever, in order to make us better human beings, in order to make us feel not just divinity, but make us feel wisdom, make us feel how to judge wrong from right, how to do the right thing. What is the right thing? What do you do if you are asked to govern over people who have a different religion than you have? What are you supposed to do with that? Are you supposed to kill them? Are you supposed to convert them? Are you supposed to tax them? Are you supposed to be nice to them? Are you supposed to put them in a particular place? Are there rules? Are those rules themselves ethical? So all of these questions are questions that Chachnama is interested in answering. And what it does is it answers them through these stories. It answers them how a Brahmin Chach has to deal with a Chandal Dalit community, how a Brahmin Chach has to deal with a Buddhist community, how a Brahmin Chach has to deal with what we can imagine are kind of Sindhi, Kashmiri rulers. Whether they are Shaivite or Vaishnavite, it's unclear, but different than Chach. Process of political theory is storytelling for a state, for a governance, for a people who have to rule in Uch Sharif. So this text says in the very beginning, it's dedicated to Nasiruddin Kabacha. Why would Nasiruddin Kabacha, who is a military commander, who's literally fighting Genghis Khan and the Mongols every day? He's just 3 years before this text, he was he was surrounded by the Mongol army and only survived because he had enough water and food to last the invasion. Why would Nasiruddin Kabacha care about something that happened 500 years ago? What business does he have? He doesn't. So what he does care about is how to be a good governor, how to make sure that his rule, his conduct is good. And he looks for historians, and he looks for people like Ali Kufi, not only Ali Kufi, but there are other people who are writing next to Ali Kufi, who are in his court, and he looks for them for this guidance. And Chachnama, thus, is a story that is being told to a ruling elite about how to be proper rulers in the 13th century.
Thank you, sir, for helping us discern through this example that you've shared with us the production of a historical text. How history is to be read with or without the physical evidence that corroborates it. My last question again is fielded to both our speakers today. Sir, how do we see Chachnama today? What is the context of it? How do we revisit it today?
If Manan Saab allows me to take the lead, basically the question is very interesting. It is multi-pronged. Once you are just worried about the relevance of this whole historic narrative with the modern times, you see there is a relevance. The modern times, as Manan Sahab was already pointing out to us, that you see these are the political contingencies of the times that is served by so many of those historical works. So it is one of the interesting study. If we look at the Chachnama, it helps us. It actually helps us to understand the forces which are operative in each phase of it.
Beautiful.
And at least three such currents have been identified during this conversation. You see, the times are such that we have newer and modern means of investigation being available to us, the multidisciplinary approach within our field of archaeology has opened up so many new areas, and much information is ascertainable through application of various sciences.
Yes.
Likewise, within history, as
Mm.
Manan Sahib was indicating, that history should not be read as a history, but it
Mm.
should be read as a
In-
possible ground of probing into various directions.
I mean, I guess I'll say one thing. I think when Dr. Lashari does his work, when he does his archaeological work, his epigraphic work, his material numismatic work, if he puts up a a photograph of a gravestone in Makli, no one besides someone of esteemed caliber of Dr. Lashari can say, oh, I know what this means. I know how to read this. I know how to understand this. I can decipher this. I have an opinion about this. So what happens is that in some ways, what Dr. Lashari does is a product of science, and people who want to understand Makli, they can't just go walk to Makli and walk around in various parts of Makli and say, oh, I know Makli, I understand Makli. No, they have to read Dr. Lashari. They have to read other scholars. They have to see people who have been trained their whole life to understand a place, and they read those scholars. And from those scholars, they come up with some understanding, and they say, well, scholars used to think about Makli in this way, but now they think about Makli in that way. Now, what happens in the age of Google is that someone can put up a translation of Chachnama done in 1901. And your young person can say, oh, I can read that. That's in English. And it says this, and this. And based on this, and this, which I can read, and I am fully capable of understanding it, I can tell you Raja Dahir was my hero. I can tell you Muhammad bin Qasim is my enemy. What is happening is that I am a trained historian. You know what I mean? Like, I worked for a very long time in order to read the Chachnama. When I write a book on the Chachnama, people are like, well, I can read a translation from 1900, and I think that translation, my own reading of this is that this is what it says. So this is what's the problem. The problem is we are suddenly jumping to the 7th century, and we're saying we can understand something that was said to happen in the 7th century. And like I said earlier, we can't even understand what happened in 1948. We cannot understand it because it's so complex. It's so tortured. There's so many voices that we don't know how to hear them. I think the question that is, should people be reading Chachnama? No, you can't understand the Chachnama. Read scholarship. Don't just read me, read other scholars. Read people who are writing about history. Read the historians, and then learn from them, and then engage with them and think through them. We have to believe in expertise. We have to believe in the historical sciences, archaeological sciences, literary sciences, literature, right? When you write your PhD, people should read your PhD, not just like open up a book of Sindhi, short stories and be like, yeah, I can understand that. So I think it's really the idea that the past is not simply inheritance. It's not just that we inherit the past. The past informs who we are. And in order to understand that, we need experts in the past. Your claim of understanding your grandfather cannot simply be that he was my grandfather, or I have a grandmother and hence I can understand them because I'm biologically related to them. The generation of our grandparents, if we are to understand who they were, what they did, why they did, we have to hear from that world, not just from those individuals. That world comes to us through people who specialize in thinking of scholarship. So that's why you can't just read the Chachnama. You know what I mean? You have to think about scholarship. And if this is the thing that we do, we need to think about history not as just available to everyone. We need to think about history as a science that we need to commit to. We need to think about our past as our mutual kind of inheritance as a project. And we need to work together to kind of understand this history and what it means to us as a collective.
Thank you, sir, for helping us discern through the instance you shared history from other forces and understand the production of a historical text with physical evidence or the absence of any corroborating material. Also, Lashari sir's expertise and the details with which sir has taken us through the physical journey of the time at which the Chachnama was written has helped us truly. We need this scholarship to see history not only as history but as a possible ground for multiple inquiries. We need experts to fully understand, make us fully understand the layers and the complexities involved in it, and that it should be an ongoing process to see how the past informs the present. Thank you, Lashari sir and Manan sir, for sharing your expertise with us today. Thank you for taking your time. We thank our viewers for tuning in, and we look forward to them joining us for our other sessions on Doorway to Sindh webinar to enjoy this journey to Sindh with our wonderful speakers. Thank you, everyone.
अजब उतर पार दे ताड़े की तवार अजब उतर पार दे ताड़े की तवार हारन हर संभारा मुझा सरया ता संकार अजब मुझे यार वसन गावे सकिया अजब उतर पार दे ओ अजब उतर पार दे ककर तो कार करे अजब उतर पार दे ककर तो कार करे वसे तो वड पुड़ियो कालक खंड भरे विजण निशान वरे मुझ सकार सुख दिए हो तो के सिंधड़ी सारे हो तो के सिंधड़ी सारे